I've always said that a man's lawn is the truest reflection of his soul. Some people think that's dramatic, but they've probably never stood at dawn, hose in hand, feeling the mist rise from the grass like holy incense. Out here in Cottonwood, Arizona, religion and lawn care are about the same thing. They both demand faith, patience, and a good pair of knees. My name's Harold M. Jenkins, retired postal worker, Korean War survivor, and current president of the Green Blade Society, a title I gave myself because, well, nobody else wanted it. Our society has 4 members, counting my neighbor Gus twice because of his split personality when it comes to fertilizer brands. From the outside, we're just a bunch of wrinkled old men hunched over sprinklers and mower blades, baking under the desert sun. From the inside, or at least from where I stand, we're the last defenders of order in a chaotic world. When the days blur and your bones creak like porch boards, there's something noble about having one perfect patch of green to control. From the street, Harold looked like a relic from another time. Khaki shorts, black socks to the calf, and a sun hat that had once been white. Every morning, his silhouette appeared in the shimmering heat, moving slowly across the yard like a priest performing a ritual no one else remembered. My lawn wasn't just grass. It was identity, a square of resistance against the creeping beige of the desert. I knew every blade by name, metaphorically speaking. Kentucky bluegrass, a touch of fescue near the mailbox, both species considered suicidal in this climate. But that's what made it glorious. Some people climb mountains, I grew impossible grass. The mornings were my favorite. The world still quiet, the coffee still strong, the air just cool enough to pretend summer might be merciful. Then Gus would shuffle out next door, waving his mug like a distress signal. "Morning, Harold. You're up early again?" "Gus," I'd reply, "the grass doesn't wait for lazy men." He always laughed, that soft belly laugh that said he'd stopped taking anything seriously decades ago. Gus was a retired math teacher who once calculated the optimal mowing pattern for his yard and ended up with a design that resembled crop circles. He called it lawnometry. I called it lunacy. Then there was Frank, ex-accountant, widower, the kind of man who kept his receipts alphabetized. He measured his fertilizer ratios the way NASA measured rocket fuel. He once told me, dead serious, that if he could balance his lawn's pH, he could balance his life. I didn't argue. And finally, Marty, our supplier, our philosopher, and our chaos engine. He used to run a lawn equipment store until it burned down in '03, a tragedy he insists was caused by spontaneous mower combustion. Marty could fix anything with duct tape, coffee, and inappropriate optimism. Together, we were the Green Blade Society. Every Thursday morning, we met at Gus's porch, each armed with a thermos of coffee and a strong opinion. We discussed mower blade sharpness, water pressure, the ethics of pesticide use, and occasionally life and death. Gus would call it philosophy for the photosynthetic. I called it old men hiding from their wives. From a distance, their meetings looked like any small-town gathering. 4 old friends sitting in lawn chairs watching the world go by. But listen closer, and you'd hear strategy, military-grade planning disguised as idle chatter. They weren't just tending grass, they were tending purpose. That summer, the drought came. The first signs were subtle, the soil turning from brown to something closer to bone. The news anchor on Channel 4 said it was the driest season in 70 years. Gus said, "My lawn's seen worse." He was lying. At first, we ignored it. We increased watering cycles, mixed homemade fertilizer, even whispered encouragement to the wilting blades. But nature was stubborn, and the city council was worse. It started with a letter. White envelope, official seal, and the kind of bureaucratic language that tries to sound polite while stabbing you in the heart. Due to ongoing drought conditions, the city of Cottonwood hereby restricts all non-essential water use, including residential lawn irrigation. Non-essential. That word hit me like a personal insult. I stared at it for a long time, as if I could will it into meaning something else. To them, a green lawn was a luxury. To me, it was proof that life could be tamed, that even in a land that forgot rain, something could still grow. Gus came over that afternoon, holding his own copy of the letter. "Well, Harold," he said, "looks like the city declared war." I nodded solemnly. "Then we'd better get organized." And that's how it began. The last great campaign of the Greenblade Society. A secret operation carried out by men who had too much time, too little water, and absolutely no intention of surrendering. The world thought we were just 4 retirees with nothing left to prove. They were half right. Later that evening, the desert sky turned violet and gold. A hot wind swept through Cottonwood, lifting dust across the sleeping lawns. In the fading light, Harold stood by his sprinkler, motionless, the hose coiled at his feet. To anyone watching, he was just another old man at sunset. But in his mind, he was already planning his counterattack. When you've spent 40 years living by the rhythm of sprinklers and mower engines, silence becomes suspicious. The morning after the water ban, Cottonwood felt wrong. Too still, too dry. The sound of sprinklers, that sweet, steady hiss of life, had vanished, replaced by the distant buzz of cicadas and the occasional cough of a dying air conditioner. I stood at the edge of my lawn, hands on hips, watching the grass fade from green to the color of disappointment. It had taken me 15 years to coax this patch of earth into submission, and now, with one government letter, it was sentenced to death. You'd think after surviving war, marriage, and cholesterol, a man would learn to accept the things he can't control. You'd be wrong. From across the street, Harold looked like a statue of defiance, unmoving, hose in hand, staring at the ground as if it daring it to stay alive. A pickup truck rolled past, the driver shaking his head. Everyone in town knew about the Greenblade men, eccentric, proud, and one heat wave away from madness. Gus wandered over around 9. He was wearing his lucky mowing hat, which was mostly duct tape at this point. "Well, the city means business. They even shut off the hydrant by the park." "That's vandalism against hope," I said. Frank joined us, holding a clipboard like a man who intended to audit the apocalypse. He said, "I measured the soil moisture. We've got maybe 3 days before total desiccation." Total desiccation, that was Frank speak, for the grass is doomed. Marty arrived last, holding the jug of something brownish. He said, "Don't panic. I've been experimenting. Homemade liquid fertilizer, coffee grounds, eggshells, a little bit of beer. My lawn's been drinking better than I have." He poured some onto his hand. It looked like a melted milkshake from hell. Gus muttered. "It smells like roadkill." "That's how you know it's working," Marty grinned. We stood there, 4 old men in a line, staring at our dying lawns like generals facing a battlefield. To an outsider, it would have looked ridiculous. Retirees waging emotional war against nature and municipal policy. But beneath the jokes and the grumbling, there was something genuine. For men whose usefulness had been slowly stripped away by age, the lawn was the last thing that still listened to them. That afternoon, I decided to test the limits. The city's rules said no watering between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. Fine. I set my alarm for 2:30 a.m. When the world was asleep and the stars looked half bored, I crept outside, barefoot, hose in hand. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and rebellion. I opened the tap just a little, enough to hear that comforting hiss. The water sparkled under the porch light, kissing the grass like a secret. And then, headlights. A city patrol car rolled by, slow and deliberate. I froze, half crouched like a burglar in his own yard. The officer didn't stop, but his spotlight swept across my property. The beam lingered just long enough to make me feel like a criminal. When he was gone, I turned off the tap. The lawn glistened faintly in the dark, like it was proud of me. The next morning, a flyer appeared on every door. "Attention residents, unauthorized watering will result in a fine of $500 per incident. Let's conserve together." "Conserve together," I muttered. "What they mean is wither alone." Gus came by, holding his copy of the flyer. "We're not going to take this line down, Harold. I say we go underground." "Underground?" "Metaphorically, maybe literally. We could reroute pipes from the old hydrant line." I raised an eyebrow. "You want to commit plumbing terrorism?" He shrugged. "You got a better idea?" Frank suggested rationing gray water from our washing machines. Marty proposed building a network of rain barrels, despite the fact it hadn't rained since Elvis was alive. That evening, we gathered in Gus's garage, our unofficial war room. The air smelled like gasoline and moral ambiguity. Frank brought maps of the neighborhood. Marty brought beer. I brought my sense of righteousness. We planned. We schemed. We argued over hose fittings. By the end of the night, we had a name for our rebellion: Operation Green Dawn. Our mission: keep the lawns alive no matter what. Our rules: none that made sense. At the same hour, the mayor of Cottonwood was giving an interview on local television, praising community cooperation in these challenging times. Meanwhile, 4 old men in a dim garage were drafting the blueprints of a suburban insurrection. The city had no idea what it had started. The next few days turned into a strange rhythm of guilt and pride. Every time I looked at my dry lawn, I felt like I'd failed. Every time I snuck a few drops past midnight, I felt like a hero. Neighbors started whispering. Some called us the water bandits. Others secretly asked for tips. That's how small revolutions start, with envy and dry grass. On the 5th day, the soil cracked. Literally, a long, jagged fissure ran through my lawn like an old scar. I stood there, staring at it, feeling something in my chest crack a little too. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. Gus joined me. "Do you think we're crazy?" he asked. I said, "Definitely, but so was the guy who invented irrigation." He laughed quietly. "Maybe we're just holding on to something that's already gone." I said, "Maybe, but if we let go of everything that's gone, what's left to hold on to?" The desert stretched out before us,
endless, dry, and glowing orange under the moonlight. Somewhere out there, a coyote howled. It sounded like mockery. In Cottonwood, the drought deepened. The news showed cracked reservoirs and angry town halls. But in one quiet cul-de-sac, 4 stubborn men were preparing their next move. They didn't know it yet, but their little rebellion was about to spiral far beyond sprinklers and hoses.
If you never lived through a suburban drought, let me tell you, it's less about thirst and more about humiliation. You start to feel like the universe itself is judging your landscaping choices. The dust sneaks into your house, your shoes, your lungs. And worst of all, it makes you confront the ugly truth. Without water, you're just a guy standing on dead grass with a useless hose. But we weren't ready to surrender. Not yet. The first rule of suburban life is simple. If you hear nothing for too long, trouble is brewing behind a clipboard. It was a Tuesday morning, bright and unremarkable, when the enemy finally made its move. I was sitting at the kitchen table, halfway through my second cup of coffee, when I saw the envelope. Cream-colored, thick paper, the kind that screams importance before you even open it. And there, printed in solemn Helvetica, Homeowners Association. I felt my left eye twitch. You see, I'd been expecting this moment ever since Nelson installed that infernal smart sprinkler system. A man can't keep his lawn greener than everyone else's for long without attracting the bureaucratic equivalent of sharks to blood. I tore it open with a butter knife, fitting, since the HOA likes to spread its rules just as thickly. Dear Mr. Thompson, it has come to our attention that your recent lawn maintenance practices may be in violation of Section 3B of the Desert Ridge Estates Community Water Management Code. You are required to attend a compliance meeting this Thursday at 5 p.m. to discuss appropriate corrective action. Respectfully, Desert Ridge Estates HOA Board. Appropriate corrective action, I said aloud, sipping my coffee. That's bureaucrat for we're about to waste your time. From across the street, Nelson waved, cheerful as ever. His sprinkler heads rotated in perfect sync, like a precision military parade. He raised his mug of coffee in salute. Got a letter too? He shouted. Yep. Guess we're both on their most wanted list. Welcome to the club, he laughed. Coffee and despair at 8. By Thursday, I was ready. I put on my best polo shirt, the one that said World's Okayest Golfer, and drove to the HOA office, which was conveniently located inside a strip mall between a yoga studio and a vape shop. The meeting room was exactly what you'd imagine. Beige walls, plastic chairs, a whiteboard that hadn't seen action since the Bush administration, and 3 board members sitting in judgment like a suburban tribunal. At the center sat Diane. You could tell she was the type of person who alphabetized her spice rack and wrote Yelp reviews about municipal parks. To her left, Mark, who wore a Bluetooth earpiece even though nobody was calling him. And finally, Trudy, who looked like she'd been born holding a clipboard. Mr. Thompson, Diane began, in that careful tone people use when they're about to ruin your day politely. We've received multiple reports that your lawn watering schedule exceeds the HOA's approved limits. I leaned back and crossed my arms. Reports from whom, exactly? Or is that classified information? Mark adjusted his invisible call and said, We don't disclose sources, but we encourage all residents to report environmental noncompliance. Environmental noncompliance, I repeated. You make it sound like I'm dumping oil in the river. I'm watering grass. Diane pursed her lips. It's about conservation, Mr. Thompson. Arizona is under drought restrictions. I nodded gravely. And yet, somehow, Nelson's yard looks like the Garden of Eden. Did his sprinkler make a deal with God? Trudy scribbled something on a notepad. I swear I could hear her write problematic attitude. We spent an hour arguing about things that should never require argument. How long a hose should run, whether 7 a.m. was too early for sprinkling, and the precise shade of acceptable green for community lawns. They had a chart, believe it or not, a laminated lawn health color spectrum. My grass fell somewhere between desert neutral and potential hazard. I tried to reason with them. Listen, I'm not flooding the place. I'm just trying to keep it alive. A little patch of green keeps me sane. But Diane wasn't having it. Rules are rules, she said, with the finality of a Supreme Court verdict. Well, I replied, so were the speed limits during the gold rush. Didn't stop people from chasing what mattered. Silence. You could hear the fluorescent lights humming. Mr. Thompson, Diane said finally, if you don't comply, we'll have to issue a fine. Fine, I said, standing up. You can mail it to the patch of dirt formerly known as my lawn. I left before they could say anything else. I may have lost the meeting, but I walked out with my dignity and the satisfaction of knowing I'd annoyed them thoroughly. That evening, Nelson came over with a couple of beers. He'd heard about the hearing, of course. News travels fast in Desert Ridge estates, especially when the gossipers are retired and have nothing but time. So, how bad was it? He asked. Let's put it this way. They've got more rules about grass than the 10 Commandments have about sin. He laughed, taking a long sip. Diane's been gunning for me, too. Last month, she cited me for having a reflective mailbox, said it distracted drivers. Distract them from what? I asked. The crushing monotony of suburban living? We both burst out laughing. That deep, honest kind of laugh that only old men share when they realize the world's gone completely mad. Later that night, after Nelson went home, I stood in my yard, looking at the sprinkler. The moonlight shimmered off the grass like silver thread. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to keep this little patch of green in a sea of beige. When you're young, a lawn is just something you mow. But when you're old, it's a piece of order in a chaotic world. A declaration that you still care, even when nobody else does. I heard the faint hiss of water from Nelson's system across the street, followed by the rhythmic sweep of sprinklers. My own setup looked humble in comparison, like an old pickup parked against a Tesla. And yet, somehow I preferred mine. The next morning, I woke up to find a second letter from the HOA taped to my door. This one was written in even sterner Helvetica. Final warning. Failure to adjust your irrigation schedule may result in a $150 fine and possible suspension of community privileges. Community privileges. As if we were living under some kind of suburban monarchy. What did they plan to suspend? My right to wave at neighbors? So I did what any self-respecting American would do when faced with tyranny. I improvised. I adjusted my sprinkler to run at midnight when no one was watching. The soft hiss of water became my nightly rebellion. It was glorious, secret, quiet, defiant. Sometimes Nelson would join me. We'd sit on lawn chairs in the dark, beers in hand, listening to the sprinklers whisper across the street. Two old men running an underground water syndicate. Then came the incident. Around 2 a.m. one night, a sudden burst of water pressure sent my sprinkler flying into the air like a NASA test rocket. It landed squarely on my neighbor Carol's prized cactus garden, snapping a few in half. By sunrise, she'd filed a complaint. By noon, I had a voicemail from Diane. By dinner, the HOA board had declared an emergency meeting. I showed up late, deliberately. They were already mid-discussion, voices hushed and serious, as if they were investigating espionage. Mr. Thompson, Diane began, we've received photographic evidence of unauthorized nighttime watering and property damage. Unauthorized, I said. Ma'am, I was simply hydrating my dreams. No one laughed. Mark pushed a folder toward me. We have the pictures right here. Inside were 3 grainy images: my sprinkler mid-flight, the cactus massacre, and my favorite, me in my bathrobe holding a wrench like some kind of midnight plumber. You've been caught, Diane said. I nodded slowly. And yet, one morning I was sipping my coffee on the porch, watching the sun bake the neighborhood, when a flash went off from across the street. A drone, small, sleek, buzzing like a giant angry bee. Nelson pointed it out first. Is that spying on us? He asked, squinting. I think it is, I said, setting my mug down. And it's the beginning of something terrible. Sure enough, later that afternoon, I found it. A post on the local community board's online page. Mystery of the miraculous lawns. Who's breaking the rules? It had 3 pictures of my front yard, unmistakably mine, drenched in water under the moonlight. The captions were dripping with suspicion and outrage. Some residents clearly think the rules don't apply to them. HOA, please investigate. And just like that, our underground operation had gone public. From the street, Harold appeared calm, sipping coffee like a man above the petty fray. But inside, he felt the heat. Not from the Arizona sun, but from sudden public scrutiny. Neighbors peeked out windows. Children pointed. The rumor mill churned at full speed. I called an emergency Greenblade Society meeting that evening. Gus, Frank, and Marty gathered in my garage, our command center, workshop, and sometimes moral compass, all in one. They've blown our cover, I said, waving my phone. Now everyone knows we've been running night operations. Gus rubbed his temples. We're doomed. Drones, social media, HOA, we're outgunned. Not necessarily, I said. We can turn this to our advantage. Marty raised an eyebrow. You mean blackmail the city with our green lawns? I shook my head. No, public relations, gentlemen. We show the town that lawns matter, that water isn't just a resource, it's a way of life. Frank, always the methodical one, began drafting a press release on his laptop. The opening line read, 4 brave men, 1 desert, countless blades of grass. A story of resilience, ingenuity, and small-scale rebellion. It was perfect. The next day, I took a bold step. I contacted the local news station. Hello, I said, trying to sound calm. This is Harold Thompson. I'd like to talk about urban horticulture and civic engagement. The producer was skeptical, but he agreed to send a camera crew. Within hours, our little suburban rebellion went on air. The segment showed me, Gus, Frank, and Marty tending our lawns, sprinklers running at night, compost tea brewing in bubbling buckets. The reporter spoke gravely about community defiance against water restrictions, highlighting the ingenuity and determination of 4 retirees who refused to let drought dictate their happiness. Neighbors watched in awe. Some cheered. Some shook their heads. Nelson's family across the street muttered something about insane lawn vigilantes. And the internet? Oh, the internet loved us. Memes appeared overnight. Green blades of glory. Desert Rebellion 101 and Old Man New Laws. Suddenly, our little fight had become a movement. From the HOA office, Diane and her board members watched the segment with horror. Their efforts to enforce order had backfired spectacularly. Instead of compliance, they'd unintentionally created suburban celebrities. But fame has its drawbacks. The first complaint came in minutes after the broadcast. A neighbor had slipped on wet grass and twisted an ankle. The HOA saw this as liability. Lawyers got involved. Suddenly, our nocturnal watering adventures weren't just cheeky rebellion, they were potential lawsuits waiting to happen. Gus panicked. We could be sued for treason against lawn decorum. Relax, I said. We'll just call it, extreme landscaping. Marty, ever the philosopher, added, History remembers the rebels, not the bureaucrats. I nodded. Exactly. And the grass is still alive, which is more than I can say for my patience with these people. Things escalated when Harold decided to join in. Sort of. His Wi-Fi sprinklers were upgraded with sensors that triggered perfect grass alerts on social media. Suddenly, our little rebellion had a rival. Now we've got a turf war, Gus muttered. This is ridiculous. It's evolution, I said. Only the greenest will survive. As the week wore on, the city council got involved. They issued official warnings to all parties. Water restrictions were enforced more strictly, but somehow our lawns remained stubbornly verdant. People whispered about our secret fertilizers, our clandestine hoses, and our midnight operations. The myth of the Green Blade Society was growing faster than any grass we'd ever planted. Late one night, I stood on the porch, looking out at my lawn. The sprinklers hissed softly. Across the street, Nelson's yard gleamed like a neon green beacon. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, as if laughing at the absurdity of it all. I sipped my whiskey and reflected. We had started this rebellion to save grass, but somewhere along the way, we'd saved something else too. Our pride, our joy, and perhaps a little bit of ourselves. The drought was still here. The HOA still existed. The city rules were still strict, but the four of us, Gus, Frank, Marty, and I, had carved out our little corner of victory. And for a moment, the desert felt less empty, the night less silent, and the world just a little more ours. By the end of Chapter 5, we had reached an uneasy truce. The HOA decided to back off after seeing the public's fascination. Local newspapers called us unlikely heroes of the desert and 4 men who refused to let the sun win. We celebrated quietly in the garage, a modest gathering of retirees with a beer for each member. No speeches, no banners, just the hiss of sprinklers, the smell of wet dirt, and the warm satisfaction of having turned a small act of rebellion into a legend. Marty raised his beer. To the grass, gentlemen. To the grass, we all echoed, knowing that this wasn't just about lawns anymore. It was about holding on to what made life worth living, even if the world wanted to dry it out.
She'd always been polite but firm, a woman who believed that yard decorations were a moral compass. One evening, I noticed her standing at the edge of her driveway, holding a watering can that looked like it had survived 3 floods and a minor fire. "Harold," she called, "I think I understand now." "Understand what?" I asked, suspicious. "That grass, your fight, it's noble." I blinked. "Noble?" "Yes," she said, pointing at my sprinklers. "And if you don't mind, I'd like to join. Just a little. I have extra water stored from my rain barrels." And just like that, a neighbor had officially allied herself with the rebellion. By the end of the week, others joined. Old Mr. Jenkins from the cul-de-sac corner started using his ornamental fountain to irrigate a hidden patch behind his garage. Teenagers with skateboards and backpacks began delivering buckets of gray water from their homes. Even Nelson, who had been our friendly rival, offered to share his Wi-Fi sprinkler data. The Green Blade Society was evolving. It wasn't just us anymore. It was a neighborhood movement, a coalition of people who refused to let a drought dictate joy. Of course, a movement this chaotic had internal politics. Gus wanted to assign night shifts, turning watering into a rotating schedule with precise logs. He said, "We can't risk running afoul of the HOA again," solemn as a general. Marty argued against it. "We're gardeners, not accountants. Let spontaneity guide us. Let the grass tell us what to do." Frank, as always, tried to mediate. "Maybe some order is fine, but don't let it kill creativity." I weighed in, leaning on my cane. "Gentlemen, if we turn this into a bureaucracy, we've become what we despise. Let's just keep it fun and let the lawns be our witnesses." Then came the problem. The city had finally taken notice. A letter arrived, official, bold and dripping with menace. "Attention residents, watering outside permitted hours will result in fines up to $500 per incident. This includes all members of the Desert Ridge Estates community." The irony wasn't lost on us. The very people who had been quietly observing our little rebellion now threatened an entire neighborhood. Nelson and I met that evening at my porch. He shook his head. "They want to crush the movement?" I sipped my whiskey. "They don't understand. They never understand until it's too late." We had a choice: comply or escalate. The decision came naturally. We decided to escalate. Operation Green Alliance was born, a coordinated effort, watering in rotation, fertilizer sharing, night surveillance to spot any HOA enforcers, and secret supply chains of rainwater and gray water. It was absurd, it was glorious, and it was organized chaos. One night, we held a neighborhood war council in my garage. Over snacks and beer, we drew maps, assigned tasks, and even came up with code names. Gus became sprinkler commander. Marty was the fertilizer philosopher. Frank was Professor Soil. I, naturally, was General Green. Mrs. Alvarez joined as rain barrel recruit, and soon we had 10 participants in the inner circle. The following weeks became a carefully choreographed dance. Sprinklers hissed in unison across the cul-de-sac. Gray water barrels flowed. Compost tea bubbled ominously in garages. It was chaotic but effective. The lawns were thriving. The town began to notice. The local news, sensing a quirky human interest story, came back to cover us. The segment showed a coalition of old and young, men and women, all working together under moonlight. The reporter called it a suburban rebellion for the ages. The video went viral locally. HOA meetings turned into spectator events. Diane and her board members were now widely mocked on community forums. It was, in every sense, a victory of absurdity over authority. But with any uprising, tension builds. Nelson, always competitive, started bragging about his yard being the greenest. Gus accused him of cheating by using his Wi-Fi sensors to predict ideal watering times. Marty and Mrs. Alvarez and her rain barrel crew argued over dosage and pH balance. At one point, Frank stormed out.
muttering something about ethics and over-fertilization being a moral hazard. Even I had to admit, we'd created a monster, but it was a monster worth taming. Then came the final showdown. A city inspector arrived unexpectedly, clipboard in hand, flashing a badge like a warning flare. He walked up my driveway, measuring tapes in one hand, a disapproving frown on his face. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "we've received multiple complaints. Your irrigation practices are outside legal bounds." I gestured to the surrounding yards, all thriving, all defying his authority. "Officer, this is a neighborhood operation. Cooperation, really. We call it civic engagement." He didn't smile. "Rules are rules. You're risking fines." I pointed to Nelson's glowing sprinklers across the street. "Officer, if you find one, you find them all. Are you ready to take it a revolution?" He paused. I swear I saw his lip twitch. Finally, he sighed and walked away, muttering something about unbelievable suburban antics. That night, we celebrated. Under the light of stringed patio lamps, the inner circle gathered. Beer bottles clinked, sprinklers danced, compost tea bubbled. And for once, the desert night didn't feel empty. It was alive, with laughter, with water, and with the soft hiss of victory. In the coming weeks, the HOA quietly retreated. Letters stopped arriving. The city still enforced drought restrictions, but our little corner of Desert Ridge Estates had survived, thriving, and rebellious. By the time dawn hit, I sat on my porch, watching the lawns shimmer. The rebellion was over, at least for now. And as I took a sip of my whiskey, I whispered to myself, some battles aren't about winning. They're about keeping the grass green, one absurd, glorious, defiant sprinkler at a time.
By the time the 7th chapter of our suburban saga arrived, Desert Ridge Estates had transformed in ways no one could have anticipated. What had begun as a simple, quiet rebellion over sprinklers and lawns had snowballed into a full-blown neighborhood phenomenon. The Green Blade Society was no longer just 4 old men sneaking hoses at midnight. It had become a symbol, a whispered legend, a tale parents told their children as a reminder that defiance could be gentle, humorous, and green. The irony was not lost on me. Here I was, Harold Thompson, 72 years old, a retired engineer with a stubborn streak the size of the Grand Canyon, now an unofficial revolutionary. We had gone from clandestine night operations to coordinated, almost ceremonial neighborhood activities that somehow straddled the line between absurdity and civic pride. And yet, despite all the chaos and publicity, something beautiful had emerged. A neighborhood alive, connected, and quietly united through a shared obsession with grass. It began one unremarkable morning that suddenly felt monumental. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood slowly wake. Sprinklers hissed in a gentle symphony, dew sparkled on blades of grass, and the early sunlight turned our small cul-de-sac into a golden stage. For the first time in months, I realized that the chaos we had orchestrated had settled into something sustainable. Our lawns had reached equilibrium, not just visually, but morally. We were no longer rebels under threat. We were stewards of our own absurd little paradise. Gus, ever punctual, was trimming his roses 2 houses down, muttering about perfect hedges under his breath. Marty, seated cross-legged on his driveway, was meticulously taking pH readings of his soil, and jotting notes in a leather-bound notebook he called the Soil Chronicles. Frank was tinkering with a new irrigation gadget that could, in theory, predict the exact moment a sprinkler should pause for optimal coverage. And Nelson, my friendly rival across the street, was adjusting the water pressure of his Wi-Fi sprinklers with a serious look on his face, as though preparing for a scientific experiment rather than suburban gardening. Even Mrs. Alvarez, our latest recruit, had joined the fold in full glory. Her rain barrels, once merely functional, had become decorative features, carefully positioned to optimize water flow while maintaining aesthetic harmony. Her yard was now a model of environmentally conscious ingenuity, a living testament to what coordinated rebellion and some clever engineering could achieve. The neighborhood had changed too. No longer were there sidewise glances or whispered complaints. The residents, initially skeptical or even hostile, had slowly become participants in this quiet revolution. Teenagers delivered buckets of gray water to elderly residents. A few younger families took to composting and distributing fertilizer tea to neighbors whose lawns were struggling. The community forums buzzed with admiration and amusement, with posts celebrating our efforts as though we were urban legends come to life. Somewhere along the line, the HOA realized that trying to enforce strict rules against this coalition would only make them the villains of a story the entire town was already reading. This, I reflected, was the unexpected beauty of absurdity. When executed properly, it could unite people rather than divide them. Yet, with fame and recognition came complications. One day, the city sent a notice. Attention residents, watering outside permitted hours will result in fines up to $500 per incident. All members of Desert Ridge Estates are subject to enforcement. I read the letter twice, then 3 times, because I thought perhaps my failing eyesight had inserted the word fines where it didn't belong. But no, $500 per incident. For watering grass? I showed the notice to Nelson. They want to crush the movement, he said gravely. I said, they'll have to take us alive, and tipped my coffee mug in a solemn salute. The inner circle convened that evening in my garage, which by now had become less a storage space and more our command center. Gus, Marty, Frank, Mrs. Alvarez, and Nelson gathered around a large folding table, maps spread out, sprinkler schematics, and graphs of water distribution. The air smelled faintly of compost, beer, and ozone from the sprinklers outside. I said, this is it. The city is cracking down. But we have allies now. People are watching. The neighborhood is watching. And the lawns, God help us, all the lawns are watching. Gus, ever the strategist, leaned in. We need a coordinated plan, rotation schedules, supply chains, and lookout posts. If we do this right, no HOA inspector or city official can catch us in violation. Marty shook his head. Too organized, too bureaucratic. Remember what started this rebellion? Spontaneity, joy, chaos. Let the grass tell us what to do. Frank, attempting to mediate, said, perhaps a compromise, some structure, but not so much that it kills the fun. I leaned back in my chair, cane tapping lightly on the concrete. Gentlemen and ladies, remember why we started this. We're gardeners, philosophers, and pranksters, not soldiers in some suburban civil war. Let's not forget the absurd joy that brought us together. Marty grinned. Fine, General Green, but only if you admit that my pH levels are probably superior to yours. I shook my head, laughing. Probably, but the grass doesn't care, does it? Finally, the long-anticipated last sprinkler operation arrived. We gathered on my porch late one night,
beers in hand, sprinklers in perfect harmony across the neighborhood. The hum of irrigation was like a lullaby, punctuated by soft laughter, whispered jokes, and the occasional splash of overzealous water. We toasted the rebellion. "To the lawns," Gus shouted. "To the lawns," we echoed. "To friendship," Marty added. "To absurdity," Nelson chimed in. "And to victory," I concluded. The moon rose high, illuminating blades of grass that had survived droughts, city regulations, HOA warnings, and a series of midnight adventures that no one would ever fully understand. Weeks passed. The HOA, perhaps exhausted or secretly impressed, ceased active enforcement. The city still maintained restrictions, but our operations had become legitimate, subtle, and socially celebrated. Community members now actively participated, and the inner circle became mentors to anyone interested in keeping a little green alive in the desert. Even the skeptics smiled. Children learned to appreciate soil, water cycles, and compost. Neighbors swapped gardening tips instead of gossip, and the legend of the Greenblade Society grew, not as a tale of rebellion alone, but as a story of community, ingenuity, and gentle defiance. On the final night of this chapter, we held a quiet celebration on my porch. We recounted our adventures, the first clandestine hose runs, the battles with the HOA, the viral news segments, the night the drone photographed us, and the time Marty accidentally drenched Gus with a motion sensor sprinkler. Laughter rang out, warm and hearty, echoing through the cul-de-sac. I looked around at their faces, weathered, joyful, slightly wild, and utterly alive. I realized that this story, this ridiculous journey, was never about grass alone. It was about friendship, resilience, and the absurd, beautiful victories that make life worth living. The sprinklers hissed softly for the last time under my supervision. The moonlight glimmered on the lawn, and I felt a deep sense of peace, tinged with nostalgia and humor. I whispered to myself, "Some battles are small, some victories absurd, but the best victories leave the heart lighter, the grass greener, and the soul quietly victorious." And with that, I took a long sip of whiskey, watched the neighborhood glow in harmony, and finally smiled. The rebellion had ended. The legend, however, would live forever.